The failure of the Democratic Party in the national election is generally conceded to have told us something about the collapse of liberalism as we have known it during the past half-century. There are those who A, insist the pieces can be picked up and reassembled, B, those who feel we should be grown up about the collapse of liberalism and move to the realism of conservative policies, and C, those who believe we should push out to the left. We have no representative here today of the first point of view to argue that Humpty Dumpty could be put together again. Accordingly, we will ventilate the other two alternatives. Our Emmett Tyrrell's new book is called, appropriately, The Liberal Crack-Up. Mr. Tyrrell has been designated by no less an authority on the subject than Tom Wolfe as, quotes, the funniest political essayist to come along in years. The book is funny but also seeks to be lethal, chronicling the disintegration of liberal illusions. Mr. Tyrrell is the editor of the American Spectator, the conservative monthly, published out of Bloomington, Indiana. Bob Tyrrell is a graduate of the University of Indiana, where he also took an M.A. in 1967. He founded, in 1970, the journal then called The Alternative, now The Spectator. He is the author of Public Nuisances and a syndicated columnist who appears regularly in the Washington Post, a singular achievement. Christopher Hitchens, representing the left, was born in England, went to the Lay School in Cambridge and to Balliol in Oxford. During the 70s, he wrote for the New Statesman. Since 1981. He has served as the Washington columnist for The Nation, as also for the London Spectator. What are your remarks on the implications of these last two defeats? Do you think it was simply reactive against incompetence, or do you think it actually was a rejection of implied political philosophy?
Well, I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but I'd like to recall to you a very striking phrase, I thought a rather clever phrase, of Norman Podhoretz commenting on the 1980 victory of the Reagan-Bush team, I think in commentary, and saying this is the election that Watergate postponed. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a clever remark. I also thought it was more revealing than it was intended to be. In order to take the line of crack-up that Mr. Tyrrell has offered us in his book and elsewhere, you've got to really believe that it was a good thing that George McGovern lost the 1972 election. Now, I think that's quite a hard position to uphold. I don't think that a liberal or a socialist like myself or any other kind of radical can look back and say it's a jolly good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that time. We, had McGovern won, would have been spared, as well as Mrs. Kirkpatrick at the United Nations and various other bizarre phenomena in the Democratic Party. We'd have been spared the appalling corruption amounting practically to a coup against the Constitution in Washington. I think we would have been spared the particularly abysmal way that the Vietnam and Cambodia wars ended, and we would have been spared the 1974 near war between Greece and Turkey and the destruction and dismemberment of Cyprus.
Up until now, you've spared knowledge that we came close to a constitutional coup. Tell me more about it.
Well, in my view, what was at stake at Watergate was not merely, as it were, the right of those at the top or in power to line their pockets or appoint their friends, but it was, under especially Attorney General Mitchell, the use, and this I call high corruption, of police and other federal agencies as if they were private property, the use of the IRS, the FBI and the CIA against political opponents, against pluralism, as it were. I mean, a very serious, as it were, configuration of
You may be a little bit behind in your readings on what happens in America. It was Robert Kennedy, for instance, who got the sex tapes on Martin Luther King. It was FDR who engaged in tapes just as fast as the evolution of technology permitted him to do so.
I think you'll find
lots of friends of Roosevelt got rich.
My withers,
friends got rich.
My withers, Mr. Buckley, are unwrung. I mean, I never tire of pointing that out in every review of a Kennedy depredation that I do. In fact, I'm on record, I think, this week in the Literary Review about that in the review of the Collier Horowitz book on the Kennedys. Of course, everyone has done it. I'm saying that in Watergate, quantity was turning into quality, that there was an attempt to institutionalize the use of agencies of the state as private political police force. If you don't think that's more serious,
well,
that's your problem and not mine.
I would think it more seriously if it was so, but I think that the FBI was used much more widely by the predecessor of Mr. Nixon for such purposes as you describe as by Nixon. I'm really mildly surprised that you think that Mr. Nixon's political appetite to control others ever reached the limits that LBJ's did. A position, by the way, which is reiterated by many friends of LBJ's political program.
Mr. Buckley, if I was to say to you that the government of Poland is a grand tyranny against its people, and you were to say, yes, but so is Czechoslovakia and so is Hungary, what is the point you're making?
Well, the point
you mentioned many enemies, you mentioned other enemies of mine in an attempt to deflect from what must be surely an obvious point, which is that the Nixon victory in 1972, the beginning of what we're asked to hail and be pleased about as a liberal crack-up, was a disaster for the United States, for its democracy and for its institutions.
This is
or would you, I mean, perhaps you haven't said, Mr. Terrell, would you rather...
It was certainly a disaster for Cambodia and certainly a disaster for South Vietnam. Unhappily, it was a democratically controlled House, a democratically controlled Senate that sealed the coffin lid in that situation. I'm not saying that Caligula is the same as LBJ, and that I have to mention him if I mention Nixon. I was simply isolating your remark that we had evolutionized America into a situation in which we were uniquely menaced, which is anti-historic.
But imagine, by the way, thinking that the presidency of George McGovern would have somehow been a great moment for American public policy and statecraft. I mean, this is the thing about
yes,
this.
I'm not a praiser of politicians, but I don't find. I think it was yesterday in your column in the Post you referred to the McGovern campaign as a gaudy campaign, which it struck me as a most extraordinary use of words for someone so, as it were, painfully honest and unglamorous.
You didn't think the mob surrounding him was gaudy?
No, I certainly did not. I mean, who on earth do you have in mind? Thomas Eagleton?
Well, it was rather bizarre.
Spectacular.
Was
you might say he was a spectacular person. I think Gaudy would be pushing it a little. I just think people should be...
you thought those people were kind of Brooks Brothers?
Should accept the logical and probable consequences of what they say. What you say is it was a good thing. What you must believe is it was a good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that election.
Oh, God,
I say
yes.
that is the root problem with.
As a matter of fact, I tend to agree more with you, but for reasons that will leave you unsmiling. Namely that I would much rather have had McGovern be there when we let down our allies in Southeast Asia than to have had Nixon do it. Nixon's preoccupation with Watergate did two things. Number one, it preoccupied him. Number two, it weakened executive power so that Congress was able to do that which it most probably could not have done under other circumstances. As I say, I would rather McGovern had presided over those 4 years of Nixon.
No, actually, unfortunately, you fail of your effect. Your answer does make me smile, because you haven't got the point that Watergate was the nemesis of a system of lying and deceit that originated in the need to lie about the war in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia. That was what necessitated the making of lying and deceit and the destabilization of opponents.
I'd have thought it was original
into an institutional rather than a random political.
In the first place, the principal lie, if we got to taxonomize these things, dates back to Gulf of Tonkin, which had nothing to do with the Republican administration. Which was accepted by the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes, and which was proclaimed by Lyndon Johnson. So that if...
Why do you feel this somehow negates what I say, the fact that it was a democratic...
Well, I don't doubt, Mr. Hitchens, that you don't like the American system. You're perfectly free to despise it. I don't like you to say, simply conveniently, that which you don't like is exclusively associated with Republican presidents, that's all.
I made no such... allegation. We're discussing.
You're talking about the unique dangers of the Watergate era.
We're discussing liberalism. I made the citation of George McGovern. It seems to me that by saying of George McGovern, he isn't Lyndon Johnson, one sticking to the truth, and to say Lyndon Johnson is a liberal is stretching it even further than Mr. Terrell does in his book.
He's much worse than Lyndon Johnson.
Here we are.
Anybody who would vote for Henry Wallace and refuses to apologize for it 25 years later is saying, in effect, that he was perfectly comfortable with Stalinist policies and with conciliation towards Stalinism in Europe. And George McGovern, who's a friend of mine, simply declines to apologize for the equivalent of voting for Hitler in 1932.
Well, there may be loyalty tests you can set that he can't pass. But I still think that to mention him and Lyndon Johnson in the same breath, say they're both Democrats, which means that they're almost liberals, and therefore that proves it, is worse than the ahistorical that you accused me of.
Well,
but I thought we were sticking to liberalism.
They
and
both
Mr.
call
how
themselves
can we-
liberals. They
How
both
can we
call
stick to
themselves
liberalism how will we even discuss liberalism with you if you won't accept that George McGovern was a liberal? I mean, that
Sorry,
LBJ was a liberal.
I'm claiming that...
I mean, we have a real problem here. We should have a Bircher here, too, because you two, with your extreme views of politics in this country, could get along perfectly.
No, but I think it's helpful that you claim Johnson's a liberal, because I think it shows what the essential category mistake of your book is, that a liberal is someone who you call a liberal, and the elasticity of your definition allows you to have a fair old romp.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you
Well,
can find...
Well, in one of his books, John Dewey, some patient scholar discovered, used the word liberal to mean 23 different things. And it's true about the elasticity of the word. After all, there wasn't all that long ago that Woodrow Wilson said the history of liberalism is the history of man's efforts to restrain the growth of government. So we acknowledge it. But as liberal is used, let's say an ADA liberal is something both of them would have designated themselves as being. How's that?
Well, Johnson and the ADA were not pals.
Oh, for God's sake. Johnson...
No. The ADA opposed Johnson back when he was thought of as being a Southern regenerate.
Mm-hmm.
They were wildly enthusiastic about him ever since. The president of the ADA, John Kenneth Galbraith, as recently as 2 weeks ago, said that LBJ was a great saint of liberalism, unfortunately tainted by the commitment to the Vietnamese War.
Well, that's
like
saying, as Hemingway said about your aunt, if she had cojones, would be your uncle. I mean, now that's helpful, I think, because that gets us nearer to the book, which I was anxious to plug as Mr. Terrell is. His book is an attack on the left, with which I am prepared to associate myself. Mm-hmm. And I think we may have, though this may have been intensely boring for everyone to watch, I think we've cleared the ground in a sense. I mean, he's not really attacking Lyndon Johnson in this book. He's attacking the left.
He's
attacking the left that survived and came out of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the movement against the Vietnam War.
You say it, Mr. We're attacking.
Well, I mean, I don't see. I'm a much more peaceful man than you are, Christopher. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm merely describing what happened in the 1970s. And what happened in the 1970s was the breakdown of American liberalism into a riot of enthusiasms. And if you would like to read, perhaps we have some organ music. Bill, did you bring your harpsichord? Christopher's about to read.
I don't.
Harpsichord means very poor organ music.
I don't think that peaceful isn't a word I'm in search of. But if you say you don't attack anyone, how come that you say the vast majority of feminists were disagreeable misanthropes, horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely? They were inferior women, contemptuous of the superior women, who through their charm and intellect have so often been able to establish such enviable lives for themselves. I could go on. I mean, I will if you like.
Go on, it's beautiful.
Why don't you plug your own book? I would say that was a critical...
I would say that was, in my opinion, a clinical description.
Not elegant, but certainly not peaceful.
Just trying to point out I know the difference between agreeable women and disagreeable women.
Well, yes, you have a number of roguish asides about yourself on this point, but you have a certain want of gallantry when you discuss the women's movement in general. One that I'm surprised in someone who is so fond of conservative affectations about the good old stylish days.
Here we are again.
Mr. Why are you actually saying that you don't attack people? Because you do.
Well, I just would like to make one point here. This man has lived on terminological inexactitude. He's lived on the misnomers that came out of the 1970s because these misnomers make it easier for him to make the ideological points he wants to make. For instance, he just referred to the women's movement. And I suspect he doesn't blanch when he sees the New York Times refer to the National Organization for Women representing the women's movement. But of course, to be precise, the women's movement is a misnomer. It refers to some women's movement. Those women being
the
feminists. I mean, there is no such thing in this country as the women's movement. It doesn't in any way represent the women I associate with. The feminists don't in any way represent the happy-go-lucky women I associate with. And it doesn't represent the views of all those who voted for Ronald Reagan.
I'm sure that's true too.
So in other words, we've got you again.
And I'm sure a woman would have to. be. I don't feel any sort of pain in my ribs. Perhaps I should have noticed.
He began by saying you were safe.
I know a rapier when I see one, and I know when I've been pronged.
Yeah, but
no, I'm sure, I'm quite happy to grant you that a woman would have to be happy-go-lucky to associate with you. But if I said the women's movement, I don't mean to say that I don't recognize women as a sex, as well as a movement too. Terminological inexactitude is not what you meant to say, is it?
It's exactly what you. It's exactly
no,
what
it's
you.
a euphemism for what you intended to say.
No,
You
no.
want to call me a liar?
No, I wouldn't call you a liar because I believe you
Well,
are.
you know the provenance of the
totally
term.
deluded.
You understand the
I'm not gonna
provenance
call
of
you
the
a liar.
term.
No, I'm not going to call you a liar. I believe that
Yeah.
you really and truly do believe these things. I've seen your performance in the nation.
I'll state my position if it's of any help to anyone. I wasn't living in America at the time, but I believe that the American left, American radicals, American liberals, many of them, in starting the civil rights movement for black Americans, in combating an unjust war in Indochina, and in beginning the emancipation of women, the way we think about sex, changed the way everyone thinks and the way everyone lives far beyond the borders of the United States. It was a tremendous time, and the whole world is in debt to the American left, I'd rather call it, for those three enterprises. Now, it's true that they're all now in rather low water, those movements, but I see no reason to sneer at them now or to forget the grand contribution they made, unsurpassed by any conservative
I think
rival.
sneering is not the right word. I would use high indignation, and in one of the three you mentioned a moral sense of true shame to have guaranteed, as we did, that we would stand by the South Vietnamese and desert them is something which is plain shameful, not something you sneer about. Now let's take civil rights, because in Mr. Tyrrell's book he talks about how what we used to call liberals indeed insisted on something called equality. Equality of opportunity, and how in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court of the United States said that it was un-American and indeed unconstitutional to take into account a person's race or color or creed in deciding whether somebody goes to the school or the other. Now, that has evolutionized. It's something called affirmative action and something now called quotas. That is viewed by Mr. Tyrrell and by a lot of liberals who endorsed the civil rights movement at that time, specifically, for instance, by Hubert Humphrey in a famous speech, something that would never happen. And that is a distortion and, in fact, a return to a kind of racism, however involuted. Do you welcome what we call a distortion?
It's probably the worst. It's probably the worst single problem that we have on the left at the moment, because not only is it, as you say, known as or reminds people of quotas. I don't believe quotas is what it comes down to. It does involve a competition for scarce resources between two constituencies who've normally been on, as it were, our side, that's to say Jewish Americans and black Americans, and this has meant that life on our wing of politics has been very tender. I don't believe that simply by legally abolishing discrimination you have abolished what led to it, the original singling out of black Americans, the original meaning of discrimination, where they were always mentioned, quoted, counted, and restricted. By saying that now stops, you avoid any responsibility for the past, and you avoid the very tangled question of how we're going to make up for
you're making a
the inherited disabilities.
You're making a cultural point. If you say, henceforth, it will be perfectly legal, as indeed it should be, for blacks to enter a restaurant, does not guarantee that every table will have one black and one white patron.
No.
And the point is that any laws that sought to bring that about would be laws which, if one were properly grounded philosophically, one would resist rather fiercely, certainly more fiercely than you have. Now, what about the business of the women's movement? I despise and am horrified by the sharp rise in family desertion. And it seems to me that there is abundant evidence to argue that there has been a correlation between the so-called women's movement and the neglect of children and broken homes.
The whole movement, as a matter of fact, has been a terrible failure. A few minutes ago you talked as though this has been a great success, what's happened to America. The truth of the matter is that a great many kids are, they're called latchkey children, and they live without parents. There's evidence that there's a high incidence of juvenile delinquency associated with these kids that are raised in homes without a father on the scene. And there's also evidence that right within the women's movement that some of these women who 20 years ago were telling the young ladies of America to go out and get careers, careers, not jobs, but careers, are now finding out that no, it didn't come out so well, and that the women ought to go back and establish friendly relations again with the opposite sex, and have children, and live the Ozzie and Harriet life once again. I would feel a little bitter if I were a 45-year-old woman who had given my life over to following the dictates of Betty Friedan, and finding out that Betty had decided that on second thought, perhaps the women of America ought to go back, these 45-year-old women ought to go back and become mothers again.
There's a very good book with a title in some way similar to yours, much better book, by George Dangerfield. It's called The Strange Death of Liberal England. It's a wonderful book. You may have read it. It's A.J.P. Taylor's favourite book. That may not commend it. That may not commend it.
You know, you just live in a world full of cooks.
I mention it, you're very sweet to say so. I mention it for this reason. It's a wonderful evocation of pre-First World War Britain, when the old system, which was basically a liberal one, came under tremendous shocks from the movement for women's suffrage, the movement to disengage from Ireland, and the rise of organised labour. And in the chapter on the rise of women's suffrage, he describes beautifully all the morbid symptoms that appear when a long repressed, especially if sexually repressed, group begin to take their own measure. The suffragette movement, simply for women's franchise, for the right of women to vote, was attacked by all kinds of people for its weirdness, for the way that women started to dress as men, to neglect their families, to behave promiscuously, and many indeed of these symptoms, up to and including suicide on some occasions, were indeed present. But when the air cleared, one could see that that was the result of the original repression. And when you say that women are now, as it were, looking for better relations with the people with whom they broke off when they had to, you're making my point. That's a phase through which that movement had to pass.
If you read, for instance, Barbara Ehrenreich's... women were repressed throughout the century.
If you read Barbara Ehrenreich's wonderful book, The Hearts of Men, socialist feminist book, you'll see, which calls for, now that we have more terms of equality, she said, with which to negotiate, let's make a deal with the men. Half our children are going to be boys.
You don't understand.
We can't get along without them. Men and women get married, as she wittily points out, exactly the same numbers. Let's do it, but let's do it now, because now we're going to be taken more seriously.
You don't understand that throughout this century here in America, with the exception of black people, particularly in the South, that this has been a free society, do you? I mean, you think the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for instance, to mention one of the repressive movements that rose up and disappeared in this country, you don't believe that was dominated and run by women, do you? You think it was probably run by men, probably Buckley, the Buckley family.
I know there's a joke there that I've missed. I'm so
the joke. Had you read the book, you'd know it.
Read it with care. Prepared to quote from it again.
You'd know that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had enormous amount of political power in this supposed country that you feel repressed women in the first part of the
century. Or as you so brightly say, feminist demands are a horse laugh. The average American woman has actually controlled two bodies and sometimes more, usually by employing only one or two parts of her own.
Pretty good, eh?
I'm so glad I didn't write it myself. The fact is, for your position to be even humorous, you'd have to say that all the women who felt themselves excluded from large parts of American life, underpaid or undervalued or underregarded, or in other ways taken for granted, were making it all up, that it was just a spree of neurosis.
You know,
that must be what you believe. In fact, I think it's pretty evident that you do.
Let me talk about something else you say. You suggested that inevitably post-emancipation there is a period of exorbitant behavior, and one oughtn't to be surprised by this. And there's a certain sense in which what you say is not impossible to validate historically. When the Latin Americans fought to free themselves from foreign tyrants, they submitted to their own tyrants. Exactly the same thing has happened in Africa. We've taken a long, deep breath, 150 years have gone by, and a few nations in Latin America flirting with democracy. It hasn't quite happened substantially in Africa, but maybe it will in due course. It's certainly true that the whole notion that there would have to be oppression from the center after the socialist revolution tended for a long time to immunize Stalin, and before that Lenin from the kind of criticisms which they had so abundantly earned. I maintain, however, that even if you are making a sociologically interesting point, what you are by no means doing is justifying any cessation of criticism during this interval. That is to say, if you do have a Colonel Idi Amin in exchange for the predecessor colonial power, the fact that you say, well, this kind of thing is going to happen before it involves democracy, does not say, therefore, you shouldn't be indignant about it or oppose it. And Mr. Terrell's thesis really is that let us indeed hope that some of the extremist feminists go back and behave and worry about things like families. But why can't we hasten that repatriation by sensible criticism?
Well, I don't think it was sensible criticism that I was just citing. I have no quarrel with your methodology at all. But in fact, Mr. Terrell is saying, just did say, that he thinks the whole thing was just a spree. It was all made up. It was promiscuity and exorbitance for its own sake. That there was nothing that they had nothing to complain about. Now, your point, I think, is much more challenging for me because, I mean, you raised the whole question of emancipation and at what cost it comes in at, and you mentioned Amin
and necessary adolescent phase.
Yeah, the position we on the left keep finding ourselves in is the victims of a sort of three-card trick. The position we on the left keep finding ourselves in is the victims of a sort of three-card trick. We take the example of, say, Iran, which Mr. Terrell dwells upon quite a lot. We said for a long time it was a mistake for the United States to overthrow the government of Iran in 1954, a crime, in fact, and a mistake to impose the Shah. We said if you keep the Shah in power, it won't work. He's a failure, a real tyrant, and there will be hell to pay. When the hell to pay actually comes and we're proved right, the chaos turns on everybody, and who's identified as the wrong person to have been? We are, for having told you. And we're supposed to take the blame for the collapse of what we always oppose. Well, this is the three-card trick that's played throughout this book, and it's played very widely at the moment by the Reagan
He believes in a world without problems. He believes he's an ideologue. And he has this set. You're an ideologue. You have this set of ideas here before you. This set of ideological desiderata before you, and you believe that if we live up to these desiderata, everything will be all right. There won't be problems. There won't be difficulties in government in Iran. There won't be difficulties in South America. There won't be difficulties between a man and a woman. I see now how the ideological mind has a utopian casting.
I'll let the viewers be the judge of whether I sound as if I believe any of that.
Well, the difficulty with integrating your analysis is that you assume, and in the first place, one should never use mistake and crime as coterminous in situations, in political situations. Crime involves a mens rea, and there was no mens rea that I can think of in attempting to remove Mossadegh, who was a self-proclaimed dictator. Now, you are also asking us to believe that if in 1954 Mossadegh had taken over, the age of Khomeini would never have come. Well, presumably not. But this doesn't argue that the removal of Mossadegh was not at that time the judicious thing to do. And it certainly brought 30 years or 25 years of relative progress in Iran by your standards. That is to say, attempts to give more hospitals, more schooling, more literacy, more what we call...
What about the women?
Well, first, you're familiar with the joke expression, worse than a crime and mistake. I mean, I'm sorry if I was conflating the two. I think mistake would be euphemism, crime might be an overstatement. Let's say, anyway, historic blunder. Note the irony. If you read the memoirs of those, Kermit Roosevelt of the CIA and Christopher Woodhouse of British intelligence who organized the overthrow of Mossadegh, you'll notice that their main allies in the overthrow of the Iranian left and center left were the mullahs. That it was the mobs of backward fanatics and religious leadership who were employed to do that job and who were thus given a larger role in Iran in the first place. The Shah continually compromised with them too. Indeed, though he blasphemed them by calling himself in one of his own titles the shadow of God, he certainly posed always as the defender of Shia Islam. Shia Islam is not a new political phenomenon in Iran just because it was only discovered by the newspapers when the Shah was collapsing. I'd still like to reiterate my grievance, if you don't think I'm sounding plaintive. It's that Now we're attacked, but it's all gone wrong in Iran, and life there is hell. And there's a filthy theocratic dictatorship where for some reason they can't seem to separate religion and politics. And I've no doubt there's mandatory school prayer. We who warned that this would happen if it went on under the despotism of the Shah are now blamed for it and made to carry the can.
Well, you are blamed in the sense that you were the point man at a critical period during which we forced the Shah to behave in a way that proved suicidal. You don't, when a regime is tottering, urge that particular moment for amnesty for political prisoners. Doesn't make much sense, does it?
Well, no, I've been calling for that amnesty from long before. I wouldn't stop calling for it just because the regime was tottering. I mean, you'd be asking me to do the impossible.
Well, it depends on whether you have the clairvoyance to see what the immediate alternatives are. Unhappily, Mr. Carter did not, right?
Well, if you had clairvoyance, you wouldn't be in that position in the first place. So I think there's an undistributed middle in your logic.
No, wait a minute. I'm careful about undistributed middle. If there were the foresight, if you prefer, to see to it that there wasn't a third alternative waiting in the wings in Iran. There was going to be either this madman or the Shah, who in fact was rather liberal-oriented, as these people go. If you knew that there was no third alternative, one ought not to have hesitated to back the Shah. That's not an ideological position, and certainly one with which I should think, given that you so convincingly deplore the excesses of the Ayatollah, for instance, school prayer, that you would agree with me about this.
I'm prepared to leave you occupying the position that the Shah could have been saved, because you rather say could, I suspect. In your best moments, you rather say could than should have been saved. But note that you're putting the worst case straight away. I'm asked to say what you do when a man has plunged you into a position where he says it's either me or barbarism. I would say you'd have to ask, who is this guy that he's led us to that choice? And that is the same mistake as you made with Somoza, and as you have made with El Salvador, we're in the process of making in the Philippines. And again, I can tell who's going to be blamed when it goes wrong. The people who never thought Somoza or Marcos was a good bet in the first place are going to be blamed. We're going to be told we lost the Philippines.
Yeah, but actually you haven't. You've got such magnificent control of the public forums that you haven't been blamed for anything, so don't worry about it. I find it more interesting, if I might...
Does it feel like that?
You got this terrible sense that everybody's ganging up, and this is by the way, I'm very uncomfortable, Bill. You know, we outnumber poor Christopher 2-1 here, and we disagree with him. I'd like to try to agree with him on something, just to, to be kind of chummy and not to look at, because it's very unusual for you who have spent 30 years of public life being outnumbered by the media in this country, and I have spent 45 years of public life, being much your senior.
You don't look a day
to kind of gang up on poor Christopher. But can we return to America? Because I think it's very interesting.
With Iran.
Well, if we could, I mean, because the
you raise it in your book.
One of the big problems in Iran, of course, was that Iran had a very small middle class, and it's very hard to have democratic politics in a huge country like that with a tiny middle class. And the huge number of backward people that you had all in allegiance to, or owing allegiance, or owing their affinities to the mullahs. I mean, that basically the problem isn't ideological. There was a problem of practical politics.
Let me ask a question unsarcastically. What percentage of Great Britain was middle class, say, in 1830?
In 1830?
Yeah. Would you say as high as 15, 20?
Well, it's difficult to gauge because that's before the Reform Bill, when it was decided on what basis one was middle class enough to be allowed to vote.
But it would be around that, wouldn't it? The reason I point that out is that this was a period when England did not allow votes to women, to Jews, or to Catholics. And yet history isn't as harsh on George IV as we are urged to be on the Shah of Iran, where far fewer than 25% of the Iranians were members of the middle class. So that gives us perhaps a useful historical perspective. Go ahead.
I've never thought of him as George IV before, I must say.
Christopher, you're an unusual creature in American life in that you are so rigidly ideological. And this is, by the way, something I blame you Europeans for bringing over to our shores, is this ideological cast of mind, which I believe,
But we got a few homegrown ideologues.
Well, but it's always, I know we do, and it's unfortunate that we do, but nonetheless, I think it owes itself to European politics, and the European criticism of America has often been that we aren't ideological enough. But, you know, one of the things that I think, points I make in the liberal crack-up is that it's an ideological cast of mind that leads to the kind of enthusiasm and irrational enthusiasm that you see making the liberal wing of the Democratic Party such an unmanageable menagerie today.
Well,
It's not, by the way, for instance, the New Deal under Roosevelt was not nearly so ideological as the present Democratic Party, and I might point out a point that I like to make in this book is that there is no line in logic or in policy, no direct line from the New Deal to the present gaggle of enthusiasm.
I'm not so sure I agree with you.
I figured that we did.
Because
See, I wanted to.
a lot of critics of the New Deal said what we have opened the doors to is the kind of thing that is not happening. And as a matter of fact, if you measure the distance between, let's say, the vector of Roosevelt's policies and those of Calvin Coolidge, you would probably find that distance much, much greater than the distance between Roosevelt's and LBJ's.
Well, I don't know.
Well, the Communist Party at the time, at one stage, called the New Deal fascism. And many leading American business organizations said that Roosevelt was at least a socialist, if not worse.
Yeah.
And I suppose that might be the measure of how non-ideological it was. I mean, I've now been told I have to stick up for the position of intolerance and ideological rigidity, and that I've imported it to the United States, which I think could probably have acquired it without me. But I did begin, I will just remind you, I began by saying that when I still lived in England, before I became an immigrant, I was, as many, many millions of people were, very inspired by the American examples, in particular Dr. King, but also later the movement to arrest the unjust war in Indochina.
What about
and as I say, it was American women who really began to show women in the advanced countries that they needn't live on the assumptions that dictated their lives up to then. These were the examples that stirred me and that I still am inclined to defend.
Well, there you are again. I mean, there you go again. You're in favor of... the trouble with the ideological cast of mind that you exhibit here is one of the problems is that it tends to politicize more and more areas of American life. I contend that men and women never had to be politicized on the grounds of sex, sexual or gender.
Surely they had to when they weren't allowed to vote. You had to politicize the movement to give them the vote.
Well, I'm talking about in the present. And what you had, the reason you had, what the historic evolution of women in this country was towards greater and greater freedom brought about by two things. One, the birth control pill, and the other by the need to get out and get into the workforce. Economic reasons. And there's no reason that and this was going on, I mean, the trend was very clear that more and more women were going into the workforce. And there's no reason to believe that this had to be politicized. Naturally, when they got into the workforce, when they got down to the office, there weren't enough women's restrooms. But you see, the difference between you and me is, I say this was a historical evolution, and you say this was an example of conscious repression by the American male, probably white.
Did you say that?
No, I didn't say that. That's not what I meant.
But you would say that. You would, if you were given, that you do believe that. No, you already said that you thought women were repressed in this country.
What I'll say I've noticed as a person who is, as you would have noticed, both white and male, is that attitudes of my peer group, other people like me who are white and male, I mean by that, towards women have undergone a vast improvement in the last 15 years or so. One of the good things about the civil rights movement was how it improved the moral standards of white people, and I think one of the great things about the women's movement, or the feminist movement if you like, is that it's changed the way that men think. And David, it's been for our sake as well as theirs. That's what is good about reform movements, is they're not what are now called interest groups or selfish, narrow, contained things.
But you see, you need to be enlightened in your treatment of women because you're from England. And the English, as we all know, have always had a sense of what?
Of separatism.
Of separatism. I mean, you
most
might
think
very
that
well be a
English
member
people-
of an English men's club right now.
Most Americans seem to think that Englishmen take the view that gentlemen prefer gentlemen anyway. I can't argue with that. I mean, I know what our reputation is. It'll take a lot of living down.
Let's not probe that one. But, you know, going back to de Tocqueville pointed out that in this country women were freer, given more dignity, more self-assertive than any place else in the world. So we actually have, you know, the truth is, you also have this notion that America has a great deal to be ashamed of. I don't. I think it's a wonderful country, and I'm delighted to live here, and I can see you're happy here
I went to
now.
more trouble to live here than you did, Mr. Sorrell. You were just born here. I went to all trouble to cross the Atlantic. I like it well enough to have done that. Of course, the American woman is assertive. If they weren't, they wouldn't have started the feminist movement in the 70s. It took assertive women to do that. I mean, what do you expect?
But it didn't have
Why
to
do
be
you
done.
think you've
Of course,
answered
the
me
whole
by
thing
pointing
didn't
out
have to be
this?
done. My point is, far more venom was exchanged in this advance of women that you talk about. I think it's a mixed blessing, because I think the same for every woman that happily got herself a career, there were 10 mothers made miserable for having to stay home and take care of the kids. And people like you and Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and then the fanatics out there, of course, made life for those mothers raising kids at home all the more miserable. With that awful question that would always be asked at the cocktail party to some perfectly sensible mother, what do you do? Or what do you do? My wife, of course, translates French for the American Spectator, does reviews for the American Spectator, reviews Buckley's books at the American Spectator, and she's too authentic to say,
secure. It sounds like
American Spectator.
chattel slavery to me, your wife's existence, I must say.
It's because they do wonderful literature.
I'm now, for heaven's sake, told that I'm against motherhood too.
Yeah. No. Look at you. See, you have this persecution complex. You have a persecution complex. That's another problem that the left has in this country. I just told you that in fact, Bill just tried to criticize me for something, so we could let you off the hook.
Sure, I'll give you an example, because I attacked your ungallant use of words about women earlier on. Jean Kirkpatrick, say, or Midge Decter, your great friend, and Jean Kirkpatrick, your great heroine, are people with whom I have really tremendous political disagreements, immense ones, I mean, quite unreconcilable ones. I do not say in my column, the old bitch, the old bag, the old douchebag, the old dog, the old pig. She's only in politics because she's hideous, she can't find a man. I don't say, as you say, of my sisters on the left, disagreeable misanthropes, horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely.
Did you see
now,
douchebag
and they were inferior women.
I didn't see it. Did you hear douchebag, Bill?
Now,
Billingsgate, I will not.
20 years ago or so, there would have been the temptation to say that by a female opponent would have been very strong. And probably a lot of us would have yielded to it. But we men on the left have all become infinitely nicer, more charming, more stylish, more gallant than you.
How many times have I referred to chauvinist pig?
The conservatives who say that it's terrible these days, women don't want the door held open for them anymore.
Will you defend me whenever I'm called a chauvinist pig, a Nazi, a fascist, and all that stuff?
No,
you weren't a part of that.
I know a fascist when I see one.
And?
And I call him a fascist when I do.
And do you see one?
But of course, the problem there is if someone is a
Look me in the
fascist.
eye.
The problem there is if someone is a fascist, it's not an insult. Because if you call a Nazi, you're not being rude to him, are you? So one can waste a lot of breath in this.
Well, I don't know. I think
if
you see an ugly woman, you call her ugly, you're certainly being rude.
Well, it depends. The question
Well,
of timing is
what
everything.
you're gonna make, yeah.
Timing is everything. The question is when do you break it to her?
It depends on your value system, too. Maybe she
Well,
admires
if you're in a clinic, I suppose.
Do you in any way see my point, or am I just being sanctimonious?
Well, yeah, I think you are. I mean, after all, my point is that in political discourse, you and your sisters, as you put it, in that awfully uncomfortable way, once again suggestive of an ideological cast of mind, you attack me for calling women misanthropes, or feminists misanthropes. But
horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely.
Yes, but what about the women on your side who would refer to me as a chauvinist pig, as a matter of course? I mean, that went on all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you obviously
and
know.
the difference is they're absolutely serious. They are.
Wait
See?
a minute, but Bob, you can't cite their misbehavior as authorizing your own.
No, but I don't think that I'm. He said that he talked about my language. First of all, he said I used Billingsgate such as douchebag, and of course then he went on. And there was no such word there. Those words are perfectly
I didn't
acceptable.
say you said it. I was content to quote your own.
Those words are perfectly acceptable. And I see nothing wrong with describing feminists who have been so misanthropic as misanthropes. However, I do think that it takes a certain flight of mind to refer to a person like me as a chauvinist pig. But Christopher just pointed out that it's not. That's exactly what I am.
I've also read your book more carefully than you have. It says, in the New Age, all women would be hags. This was the logical imperative of the feminist revolution.
That's right. That's what they wanted. They wanted to. It's their point. The feminist point.
It's followed by really sad abuse of H.R. Mencken's prose. I don't think you have the right to pray him in aid for a sentence like that. But you see, we don't have to, on the left, go around politicizing things when they already are.
Politicized.
No, they already are. We found them that way, and we decided to call it by its right name. I mean, as we sit here, for instance, everyone in this room has been made into a frontline soldier. The nuclear age means that we're all conscripted. We don't have the right to conscientious objection anymore. We are in the front line while the soldiers are in the bunkers. A complete redefinition of the meaning of war of the civilian. That's been done to us, whether we like it or not. We can't then complain of those who objected that they're politicizing the situation. The politicization has been done. We're all conscripted. We might as well be sitting here in uniform.
Well, you sound like one of the
and that conscription was
you
enforced.
sound like some fanatic libertarian who would say the same thing. We have to pay taxes. We've already been conscripted. We've been forced to.
I think that's a terribly good comparison.
Good enough.
Because
they haven't been conscripted.
It's good enough.
Stop. There's a sense in which it is true that we live in an age in which 2-3 people can decide on the future of the planet. And therefore, any overtures to those people require a political exertion. It is, however, not true, as Mr. Hitchens seems to want to believe, that it therefore follows as a corollary, that all movements and all relationships are equally politicized for that reason. It's true that there's no significant difference between the man in the trenches and the man in the Park Avenue in terms of apocalyptic exchange. It is not true that a housewife ought to feel that she is a part of an ongoing political movement. And it certainly is true, in my judgment, as Mr. Terrell has argued, that an effort has been made to say to all women, you are not only women, you're not only mothers, you're not only homemakers, you're not only writers, whatever, you are also women qua women. Jesse Jackson gets up and he says, I'm a black man first, I'm an American second. In saying that, he gives an order of priorities which tells a lot about him, which would have made Martin Luther King shudder, for instance. Now, I deny that we ought to permit ourselves to be so politicized. Do not deny that the effort is being made. Do insist that effort can be successfully resisted. But before we've only got a minute to let out, you made 3 interrupting remarks about Vietnam. The last one was the unjust war.
Yes.
Lots of volumes were written on Vietnam, but let me record that I had no reason 15 years ago to think it was unjust. As days go by, I am progressively convinced that which was unjust about it was our desertion in the field of people whom we had rallied to the cause of liberty in the course of explicating a series of arrangements made with the benediction of your government, Labour and non-Labour, and the governments of the Western Europe during the 50s.
It's to their eternal shame, yes, that's all.
Well, I don't think that Churchill would be embarrassed by it, nor Bevan, no Cripps.
But the war ended in a squalid and dishonourable way, as it was begun. That's how it began. It began in a squalid and dishonourable way.
I don't doubt that it did.
It couldn't have been otherwise.
It is that, well, what do you mean?
Nothing became it, as it were, like the leaving of it. It began in a squalid and
No,
dishonourable way.
the leaving of it
to
hardly became it. If you mean 200,000 boat people became or leaving Vietnam, I think that you have no.
You were talking of the American departure from Vietnam.
What were you talking about?
I was talking about the American departure from Vietnam. I was replying to you.
And
in my opinion, a war so solidly conceived could hardly have been honourably ended. The Vietnam War ended in 1954 when French colonialism was defeated at Dien Bien Phu. That's when the war was lost, and that's who lost it. All subsequent depredations by successive American governments, often supported by the British government, though never, I think, by the French, who learned their lesson by then. De Gaulle warned Kennedy a long time ago what would happen.
Do you believe that the resistance to communism is squalid?
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, but I don't understand even the logic of what you say.
And I don't blame you for trying to change the subject. I was talking about who lost the Vietnam War and when and why. Offering you my view.
It's like saying that the Philippines really, when we pulled out the Philippines in 1948, we in effect ended a relationship with Filipinos who were democracy. The hooks really are the natural heirs of I simply deny it. I see no reason at all why that mad poet Ho Chi Minh, specializing in torture and oppression, should have been encouraged when there is ample evidence to be that there were enough South Vietnamese who preferred liberty and who should have been convinced that we had no neo-colonialist designs in South Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh was good enough to be an American ally against the Japanese during the Second World War, when he became acknowledged as the leader of Vietnamese nationalism, whatever his other Stalinist traits may be, which I don't deny or seek to deny.
And Stalin was good enough to be an ally against Hitchens, so what?
Well, so quite a lot, isn't it?
So not very much.
No, I think so.
So true, correct, and under certain circumstances we would make contracts with the devil.
Right.
Not particularly flattering, but this is the kind of thing that unhappily the world is made up of, where so many political choices need to be made.
Tough ones too.
Where would you resist communism? Where would you resist a communist overthrow government?
Yeah, with what weapon do you mean?
With force.
Both questions are good. With nuclear weapons, there are no circumstances which would justify unleashing thermonuclear weapons. No outcome could be worse than that. So, which I don't think is your own opinion. I think that's to say there are worse things than communism, and by saying it, that's what I mean by it, in case you might want to reinterpret what I said.
So you would be in favour of unilateral disarmament, as Neil Kinnock is?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
If you're not going to use weapons of genocide and suicide, you shouldn't be preparing to use them. No.
So you prefer biological survival to freedom, and that's a very important.
I don't prefer it, but I would. I don't say those are the alternatives. Perhaps I should have spoken less rapidly. I don't think those are the choices. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher Hitchens, and thank you, Mr. R. Emmett Tyrrell, author of The Liberal Crack-Up. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of Yonkers Prep.